Blood hit the ground before the screams stopped. Fire devoured the wooden roofs of villages that vanished in a single night. The Huns rode in like a storm with no warning, their hooves pounding like thunder, their arrows cutting through men who barely had time to reach for a weapon. The slaughter was fast, merciless, and complete, but death was only the beginning. Those who survived wished they hadn't. Men hacked down in front of their families. Children yanked from mothers' arms, their cries drowned by the clash of steel. And the women, always the women, dragged into the shadows, their fate worse than death. To their enemies, the Huns weren't human. They were creatures born for violence. Faces carved with scars, teeth stained from blood, eyes black and cold as if they had forgotten what pity was. Their bodies stank of sweat, leather, and the rot of old battle wounds. They rode for days without rest, eating raw meat, drinking from the veins of their kills. These were not men who dismounted to show mercy. They dismounted to chain, to take, to claim. Chains rattled louder than prayers. The women knew what that sound meant, because behind the walls of fire and ash, the real horror began. The battlefield was only the first act. What came after was whispered about, but rarely written. Even Rome, with all its decadence, struggled to put it on parchment. The truth was too obscene, too revolting. The Huns were not just destroyers, they were takers. Of bodies, of blood, of futures. A woman stolen by them did not return. And if she did, she returned hollow, her silence telling more than words ever could. Imagine it, hands bound with rough leather, the gag ripping into your mouth as you choke on smoke and tears. Dragged behind a horse, your skin torn raw against the earth, your body on display as a trophy of conquest. You are no longer a person. You are a weapon, a message carved into flesh. Because the Huns used women not only for their hunger, but for humiliation. Every captive became a reminder that no man could protect his family. No kingdom could shield its daughters. To the Huns, this wasn't shameful. It was ritual. Power sharpened into cruelty. They had no cities, no temples, no walls. Their empire was built on terror itself. And the cornerstone of that terror was what happened to the women they captured. This is not a story about battles won or lands conquered. It is not about kings and treaties. It is about what came after the fire, after the swords were sheathed, after the bodies cooled. It is about the chains, the screams, the rituals that left scars on generations. And it begins with the women who vanished into the Horde and never returned. But for those who were taken, the nightmare didn't end with capture. It only began when they entered the world of the Huns. They didn't come to take land. They came to take people. When the Huns thundered through a valley, the sound alone was enough to freeze blood in the veins. Hooves struck like drums of war. Banners whipped in the wind. And when the dust settled, what they left behind was not just conquest. It was annihilation. Villages reduced to ash. Corpses piled like offerings to a god of chaos. Fields where children's toys lay scattered beside blood-soaked earth. But among the wreckage, they dragged away the living. Women torn from their homes, clawing at doorframes as soldiers ripped them free. Mothers ripped from children, their screams echoing long after their voices broke. Peasants, nobles, even queens, no one was safe. Once bound in leather straps and thrown over saddles, they vanished into the Horde, never to see home again. The camps were not shelters. They were cages without walls. Rows of tents stretched across open plains, guarded not by walls of stone, but by the sheer terror of what happened inside. Here, women were stripped of names, stripped of dignity, until they became less than human, reduced to property. They were not wives, not companions. They were trophies. Some offered to chieftains as proof of loyalty. Others gifted like weapons, their bodies traded from one warrior to the next, as if flesh itself were currency. To hold a woman was to hold power. To give her away was to prove dominance. And in this world, screens were the soundtrack of conquest. Night in a Hun encampment was worse than battle. The fires burned bright, not for warmth, but to illuminate the spectacle. Shadows stretched across tents where bodies writhed under force, pinned and broken. The night air carried the sound of whips, the weight of chains, the sobs of the defeated. A woman's value wasn't measured in beauty. It was measured in her ability to be broken. Her pain confirmed power. Her silence confirmed control. And if she resisted, it only sharpened the cruelty. Because resistance wasn't defeat. Resistance was entertainment. The men circled her like wolves, laughing, drinking, daring each other to go further. Her suffering became a stage upon which they performed their dominance. But this wasn't about lust. It was about strategy. The Huns knew what they were doing. Every act of rape was a weapon. Every violation, a scar carved not just into flesh, but into memory. To take a woman was to take her bloodline. To force her womb was to corrupt her people. Children born from this violence blurred identities, half Hun, half enemy, living proof that terror had fused nations against their will. The Romans wrote about it in whispers. Their hands trembled as they etched words on parchment, never daring to give details, only fragments. Enough to suggest horrors too grotesque to fully describe. The Goths spoke of women who returned hollow. Their eyes vacant, their voices stolen. They lived, but they did not survive. Because once a woman was taken into Hun hands, she was no longer herself. She became part of their system, their ritual of conquest. And in that system, degradation was never random. It followed patterns, hierarchies, ceremonies. A woman was taken not only for pleasure, but for spectacle. Ownership was not desire. It was domination. And domination wasn't private. It was performed. It was celebrated. The Huns didn't build cities. They built nightmares on the move. Tents soaked in sweat and blood. Fires that lit the outline of chained captives. Nights when the very air trembled with the sound of screams. They didn't brand women with iron. Their branding was repetition. Endless repetition. Breaking bodies again and again until the spirit itself dissolved. Until obedience was all that remained. And still, it grew darker. Because this cycle was not only cruelty, it was unity. The Huns believed it bound their people together. Warriors shared more than blood. They shared victims. They shared terror. They shared in rituals of power that left no room for weakness. And the more they broke their captives, the more the Horde itself grew unbreakable. This was conquest not measured in land, but in flesh. Not counted by graves, but by scars. And every scar fed the machine of fear that rolled across Europe like a living storm. But the nightmare did not end with captivity. It only deepened. Because what began as private domination soon became public ritual. What started in the shadows of tents would be dragged into the open, where humiliation became theater, where suffering became a form of celebration, where sex itself became a weapon displayed before all. The Huns didn't just conquer with swords. They conquered with silence, with screams, with the slow, methodical destruction of the human soul. And in the darkness of their camps, conquest became eternal. The night didn't bring peace. It brought theater. When the fires rose high and the drums of war went silent, another sound filled the camp, the shrieks of women dragged into the dirt, their wrists bound, their knees forced down, their screams swallowed by the roar of laughter that followed. For the Huns, this was ritual, not passion, not secrecy, but performance. Theirs was a world where cruelty needed an audience, where domination wasn't enough unless it was seen, remembered, and repeated. A woman's body became the stage. Her humiliation, the spectacle. Chroniclers whispered of captives paraded before whole camps, stripped bare, their tears catching the firelight. Forced to endure while enemy slaves were made to watch, their agony became a warning written in flesh. Every violation was a message. This is what happens to those who resist the Horde. Her cries carried further than any war horn, echoing through the night like a curse no one dared break. The sound traveled across fields, over rivers, through forests. A chorus of despair that made sure no one in the surrounding lands could ever mistake the meaning. But there was order in the chaos. Always order. Leaders came first. Their rights unquestioned. The strongest warriors followed. Rank dictated who claimed her, who broke her next. Sometimes a handful. Sometimes dozens. One after another, like wolves tearing into a single carcass, until the victim was no longer a person, but a vessel emptied out, piece by piece. Each man left his mark. Each act another conquest replayed upon the same body. And the more she shattered, the more they cheered. Her sods weren't tragedy to them. They were confirmation. Proof that she had been conquered. Proof that their power was absolute. Her body collapsed, but her collapse was their triumph. What made it more revolting was the identity of the victims. These weren't nameless peasants lost to history. Sometimes they were the wives of fallen chiefs, widows of slaughtered nobles, women of rank who had once walked through halls of stone and commanded respect with a single glance. Now they were dragged into the dirt, their silks torn, their jewels stripped away. Pride turned to ash. Their degradation was symbolic. It turned noble bloodlines into entertainment. Their bodies became reminders that even the proudest lineage could be ground into dust beneath the hooves of the Horde. And for the warriors, these acts weren't shameful. They were rewards. Victims handed out as gifts to loyal fighters. Tokens of favor, grotesque currency minted in flesh. To share in the ritual was to share in the victory. Men bonded through brutality. Brothers not only in battle, but in the degradation of the captives they dismantled together. The campfire became their theater. The screams, their music. The broken body, their trophy. This was not intimacy. It was control. Control sharpened into ritual. Humiliation turned into tradition. And every time it was repeated, the message to Europe became clearer. The Huns didn't just destroy armies. They destroyed dignity. They didn't just take lives. They took everything that made life worth living. For the women, survival wasn't survival. It was erasure. Their identities stripped away, their voices silenced, their histories rewritten by force. They returned hollow, carrying not only wounds of the body, but wounds of memory. Wounds that would outlive them, passed down in whispers to future generations, who shuddered at the name Hun. And still, it did not stop here. Because for the Huns, breaking women in front of the tribe was not the endgame. It was only the beginning. The ritual of humiliation was the first act. What followed was far darker. Once the laughter faded and the spectacle ended, another purpose emerged, one colder, more strategic. These women were not merely trophies to be broken and discarded. They became tools of empire, flesh as weapon, wombs as battlefields. Through them, bloodlines were rewritten. Through them, identities blurred. Through them, nations were shattered without another sword being lifted. For the Huns, conquest did not end with death. It continued with life. Every child born of violence was a reminder of submission. Every scar carved into flesh was a mark of empire. And every ritual repeated beneath the firelight ensured that terror itself became tradition. The night never brought peace. It only brought the theater of horror. A woman taken by the Huns was never truly freed. Her captivity did not end with chains, or even with the passing of time. Her body became a battlefield long after the swords were sheathed, long after the fires of conquest dimmed. For the Huns, rape wasn't a crime. It wasn't even lust. It was strategy. Every act forced upon her was a seed of conquest, a weapon buried inside flesh. Each violation was a future carved into her body, a scar that would grow into lineage. Captives were not only used, they were made to carry, sons and daughters born from violence. Half Hun, half enemy. To the women, they were chains that never came off, breathing reminders of nights that never ended. To the Horde, they were proof. Proof that conquest had gone deeper than bloodshed. Proof that their power stretched beyond land, beyond plunder, into bloodlines themselves. Ramang and Gothic chroniclers dared to whisper it. They wrote of women forced to bear children for the very men who had slaughtered their kin. Some mothers watched their newborns ripped from their arms, discarded like refuse. Others were left to raise them, trapped in camps where every glance at the child's face became a wound that reopened daily. It wasn't survival. It was torment on repeat. And for the Huns, these children blurred the lines between victim and kin. Some were raised as Huns, trained to ride horses before they could walk, taught to fight, to kill, to become weapons shaped from betrayal. Imagine watching your child grow into the image of your rapist. Imagine feeding it, clothing it, knowing its blood carried the same brutality that shattered you. This was psychological warfare at its most intimate, a slow poison that lived on in flesh and blood. Not every child was allowed to live. Some were smothered at birth, tiny cries silenced before they could grow. Others thrown aside, abandoned in the wilderness, left to the wolves and crows. And still, some were sacrificed in ritual acts of horror, their deaths twisted into ceremonies meant to bind the Horde in fear and superstition. To the Huns, life was a tool, death was a weapon, and neither was sacred. Those who survived carried the legacy forward. They marched beside their fathers, their mixed blood seen as strength, not shame. In the eyes of the Horde, these children were proof that no enemy could resist them, that even wombs had been conquered. Resistance only created more of them. Every woman taken, every child born, was another step in rewriting the enemy's future. The Horde grew not only by sword, it grew by womb. And Europe knew it. Kings, priests, and warriors feared it. Because the Hun invasion was not just of land, it was of lineage. It was the reshaping of nations at the most intimate level, the theft of futures before they could even begin. This was the true turning point, the moment where conquest went deeper than the battlefield, where domination carved itself into the next generation. The Huns weren't just destroying families. They were rebuilding them in their own image, piece by piece, scar by scar. And still, inside the camps, the nightmare did not end with forced births. It grew worse, because even Hun women weren't safe. The rituals of control reached inward. They twisted their own tribe into a cycle of fear and violence that fed on itself. Women of the Horde, though clothed as wives and mothers, were never free from the shadow of domination. Their status could be stripped in an instant, their dignity crushed if it served the will of their leaders. For the Huns, the system was total. Captives and kin alike were absorbed into a culture where flesh was property, where the womb itself became a weapon, and where life and death were nothing more than strategies of war. The swords might have gone silent, the battles might have ended, but inside those camps, conquest never stopped. It pulsed in blood. It screamed in childbirth. It lived on in children who bore the faces of conquerors. And in this way, the Huns ensured that even when the fires of war faded, their victory remained eternal. Blood didn't only flow on the battlefield. It ran through the tents of the Huns themselves. Outsiders feared their raids, the thunder of hooves, the fires, the corpses left behind. But inside the Horde, the terror did not rest. It lived in every camp, in every household. Wives, daughters, even Hun-born women. None of them were safe. A woman's body wasn't her own. It was property. And property could be used, beaten, broken. Marriage was no sanctuary. It was transaction. A trade sealed not with vows, but with violence. A wife was not chosen. she was taken. A husband could demand, a wife could not refuse. To resist was to invite punishment. To resist was to invite death. The home was no refuge. It was another battlefield. Walls of felt and leather offered no protection, only silence and obedience. Those were the only shields a woman had, fragile, brittle, always on the verge of shattering. When a warrior fell, his widow didn't grieve in peace. She didn't even own her mourning. Some sources whisper of rituals where comrades claimed her body first, a final act of dominance over the fallen man. Her body became the last battlefield of her husband's war. Afterward, she was passed into another man's household, stripped of choice. She was never a wife. She was inheritance. Flesh redistributed like spoils of war. Polygamy wasn't luxury. It was control. A system where women were shifted, exchanged, shuffled between men like livestock. To the Huns, this wasn't indulgence. It was management. A careful order designed to ensure women never had choice, never had escape. And jealousy, that most dangerous suspicion, was crushed with fire and blood. If a wife was accused of betrayal, punishment came swift and merciless. Mutilation that carved dishonor into her skin. Execution that silenced her voice forever. Or worse, public violation, staged brutality that erased shame by breaking her before the eyes of the entire tribe. Her suffering became spectacle. Her body, a warning. Every other woman watching knew the message. Obedience was survival. Silence was life. Even daughters weren't spared. In a culture where everything had a price, girls were commodities. Promised to warriors before they even reached adulthood. Traded for alliances. Handed away as bargaining chips in negotiations, carved with blood and iron. Childhood stolen. Futures sold. Their lives dictated long before they understood what was happening. Some were given to men decades older, forced into beds before they even knew what marriage meant. Others were exchanged between clans like coins, tokens of loyalty, symbols of submission. The cycle was endless. Captives enslaved, wives beaten, widows passed around, daughters bartered. Violence turned inward until no one was safe. Not the prisoners, not the wives, not even the children of the Horde itself. The cruelty was not only for enemies. It was the marrow of Hun life. Every tent concealed it. Every firelight revealed it. The Horde did not merely conquer the outside world. It conquered its own again and again in a cycle of domination that never ended. And at the center of it all stood one figure. One shadow that loomed over every tent, every campfire, every act of terror. The man who embodied the violence. Who made it law. Who carried it farther than anyone before him. Attila. He was not simply a leader. He was the embodiment of fear. His name carried weight heavier than swords, sharper than blades. For the Huns, his word was absolute. For their enemies, his shadow stretched across Europe like an endless eclipse. But inside his horde, his power reached beyond the battlefield. He enforced the system. He sharpened the rituals. Under his gaze, women were not lives. They were tools. They were property that cemented loyalty, strengthened unity, and spread terror both inside and beyond the camps. Attila did not invent the cruelty, but he perfected it. Under him, the blood that ran through Hun tents became the lifeblood of empire itself, feeding a machine built not only on conquest of land, but on conquest of flesh. He was called the Scourge of God, a name spoken like a curse, spat in fear. Attila, a man who carved empires out of fire and bone, a predator who fed on ashes, who built kingdoms not from stone but from screams. But his hunger didn't end with conquest. It spread into every corner of his life, into every woman he touched, into every bed he claimed as another battlefield. His marriages were endless. Brides lined up like trophies, displayed for all to see. Some were Hun noblewomen, tied to him through bloodlines and political bargains. Others were captives torn from smoldering cities, dragged into his tent, still smelling of smoke and grief. Each one reduced to a symbol of power, a hostage draped in wedding cloth. For Attila, a wife wasn't chosen. She was taken. Each union was a weapon. Each body another brick in the empire he constructed out of domination. Chroniclers whispered of the nights behind closed tents. Nights where women didn't simply share a bed. They endured it. Submission was expected. Resistance was punished. Attila demanded loyalty on the battlefield, and the same submission in the silence of his chambers. Sometimes violent, sometimes fatal. His lust was not desire. It was domination disguised as ritual. Concubines and wives lived in constant fear. To please him was survival. To fail him was death wrapped in silence. There were whispers of women who vanished, erased without a trace. Their names stricken from memory as if they had never existed. Their bodies buried under the weight of secrecy. Attila devoured everything: land, gold, people, even those closest to him. And then came his final night. A wedding feast, yet again. Another young bride placed before him, trembling under the weight of his legend. Her face pale, her hands shaking, her body forced into the role of wife when she was nothing more than a captive adorned in silk. The hall was heavy with smoke and wine. Warriors roared like beasts, cups overflowing, their songs shaking the walls. Attila sat at the center, the eye of the storm. He drank deep, darker and deeper, as the laughter swelled and the fires burned higher. The bride sat in silence, her fear hidden behind downcast eyes. She knew the ritual. She knew what awaited her. The night dragged into shadow. The feasting bled into silence, and the silence bled into horror. By dawn, the world changed. Attila the Hun was dead, his body found still, his face frozen in blood. Some swore the bride had struck him down, vengeance carried out in secret with a hidden blade. Others whispered he drowned in his own blood, suffocating after a violent night of indulgence. There was no battlefield, no clash of armies, no glory. Only the chilling quiet of a bridal chamber turned tomb. The truth remains a shadow. But what terrified Europe most was not how he died. It was what killed him. The possibility that the empire's most feared ruler, the predator who weaponized lust and terror, was undone by the very excess that defined him: power, violence, sex. His own obsessions collapsing back onto him, crushing him in the dark. That night, the cycle came full circle. A man who ruled through fear of flesh met an end soaked in it. His death didn't bring relief. It sent shockwaves across the land, tearing through tribes and kingdoms. Allies scrambled, enemies trembled, because the nightmare he created didn't die with him. His shadow lingered, etched into memory, carried in stories of terror that echoed long after the pyres burned out. Attila was gone, but the horror he unleashed, the sexual violence of the Huns, the empire built on bodies, lived on like a curse. It haunted the lands he scarred. It haunted the people he broke. And it haunted the memory of Europe, a reminder that some wounds never heal, some shadows never fade. The scourge of God was dead, but his legacy was eternal. The empire cracked like bone under a blade. When Attila's body was lowered into the earth, the Huns' power went with him. The riders who once thundered across Europe broke apart, scattered into dust. Their camps fell silent. Their banners collapsed in the dirt. The world exhaled, but the relief was poisoned, because the terror didn't vanish. It lingered, crawling into memory, festering into legend. The tents burned away, but the stories didn't. Survivors carried whispers across borders. Priests wrote of the sins of the Huns in trembling script. Mothers warned children at night, "Beware the riders with blood on their mouths." Every account of their violence carried one constant note, not just the slaughter, but the defilement. Women taken, broken, discarded. Children born not of love, but of war. Entire lineages tainted by conquest. Europe learned to fear more than just the sword. They feared the seed the Huns left behind. Chronicles called them demons who bred terror into bloodlines. The word Barian became stained with images of forced rituals, of shrieks behind leather walls, of power carved into flesh. For centuries, the shadow of Hun cruelty became the standard of savagery, the nightmare every tribe was measured against. Writers in Rome and beyond twisted the memory into something almost supernatural. They didn't see the Huns as men. They saw them as monsters, demons in human skin, feeding on both body and soul. Even centuries later, poets and historians painted them not as conquerors, but as corruptors, as if their presence had poisoned the earth itself, as if their lust had rewritten the blood of nations. But history rarely speaks of the women. Their names dissolved into silence, their bodies left unmarked in graves or not buried at all. No chronicles preserved their cries. No parchment recorded their torment. Yet their suffering haunted every whispered legend, every horror story passed down in firelight. Their ghosts lived on, not in names, but in fear, in the unshakable memory of what it meant to be claimed by a Hun. The true scar of the Huns was not their empire. It was the echo of pain they left behind, the way they weaponized flesh, the way they made every woman's body another battlefield. The swords rusted, the horses died, but the nightmares endured. Every generation that remembered them carried the weight of that terror, as if the Huns had never truly died. What made them unforgettable wasn't just the cities they burned or the armies they crushed. It was what they did in the shadows, away from the battlefield, where no one came to rescue the victims. The unseen atrocities became more terrifying than any clash of steel, because the screams that no one heard lasted the longest. That is the horror of the Huns, not the bodies they buried, but the souls they shattered, not the lives they ended, but the ones they desecrated and left to suffer in silence. This was their legacy, a terror that outlived them, a reputation that turned their name into a curse whispered for centuries. And some horrors don't stay buried. They echo across fields where the grass grows red, across stories written in trembling hands, across the nightmares of nations. The Huns are gone, but their shadow isn't. It lingers in the blood of history, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be feared again.